This presentation is entitled, drum roll, wait for it, Colonialism, Control, and Copulation, a primer on reproductive justice. This presentation, our students will reclaim our shared history and substantiate how coloniality still lives in our current views and social policies regarding reproductive justice. It's an incredible example of finding the threads of historical colonization as it manifests in current day issues. So with that, I'll hand it over to Heather, Ash, and Abby.
Hi, everyone. Just bear with us. We're just going to pull up our slides soon. My name is Abby Staley. I will be starting off our presentation today, and Heather will be second, and Ash will be taking us home, finishing the presentation. Okay. Here we are. So I will begin our presentation by examining colonialism and how it relates to reproductive justice in the United States through a historical lens. Before diving in, it is important to note that from the early 17th century to the 20th century, reproductive justice was not a formed concept yet. We'll discuss reproductive justice later as we go on, and throughout this presentation, we hope you'll notice how history tends to repeat itself, pulling from the same thread of colonialism to shape the demographics of the United States through reproductive control. Next slide, please. So during the colonial period, from the time of the first white European settlements until the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, population growth was crucial. The North American colonial project and the developing new nation required an increase in numbers, but specifically, from the colonizers' point of view, numbers in white folks. Colonizers saw this as a necessity for establishing, developing, enhancing, and defending their land claims and ideas around white supremacy. From the beginning, men with power used their advantages to control reproductive rights to help achieve their goals associated with power, wealth, status, and property. Next slide, please. As U.S. culture and politics began to form during this period, laws and power structures took form to racialize the nation. These laws declared that white babies had a different, more superior, and non-negotiable value compared to babies of different races. They also labeled which female bodies, along with their babies, were marked for which kinds of administration and management by the state. Under a structure composed to control population growth, anti-miscegenation laws, immigration laws, and laws criminalizing contraception and abortion were perpetually enforced. As a result, these legal systems of control continued to persist by feeding on the vulnerabilities of people without institutionalized power. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to go into the impact of the origins of racialized population control as a means of historically oppressing Indigenous populations and the commoditization of births within enslaved populations. Women of color have been targeted and continue to be targeted in distinctive and brutal ways across U.S. history. During the period of slavery in the U.S., European settlers pursued a combination of pro-natalist and anti-natalist strategies to encourage population growth of Black folks and discourage population growth of Indigenous folks. In 1662, the Virginia colony passed a law which overturned the English common law tradition that defined the status of the child, slave or free, as following the status of the father. This resulted in ensuring the growth of the slave population and propelling forward the continuation of slavery. The fertility of enslaved women was made into an exploitable colonial resource as rapid population growth among enslaved populations meant more hard labor for slave owners for them to accomplish their goals. Researchers have noted that French and British colonies in the United States even created policies that were slave breeding industries. As the fertility of Black enslaved females was seen as a commodity, the fertile Black enslaved woman was also seen as less deserving of basic human rights compared to free white women, even if they were pregnant. In 1692, the Virginia colony created a law outlawing intermarriage, marking all racially mixed children as illegitimate and forcing them to work as bonded labor. Enslaved women who were raped and impregnated by their slave owners were stolen their reproductive dignity and authority to parent. Because of this complete subordination of enslaved women, these laws were upheld. Compared to white women, enslaved women did not have any of the same sexual, relational, or maternal rights that white females could generally claim. They were not allowed to choose their sexual partners, be granted a legal marriage, or given the right to parent and protect their own children, or even know their own children. Thus, enslaved women were prohibited any control over their reproductive autonomy. Next slide, please. During the same period as the slavery regime, legal systems and practices ensured the growth of Black folks while reducing Indigenous populations. Government officials created antinatalist programs, which involved using warfare to kill, conquer, and remove Indigenous populations and territories. European settlers had a significant impact on the reproductive lives of Indigenous populations in the 18th and early 19th centuries. While many Indigenous populations lost their land, mothers also lost their pregnancies and children to genocidal wars and forced marches. Subsequently, the boarding school system also aimed to drain Indigenous peoples' cultures from the minds of youth who were being assimilated as Americans. Since most European settlers came from Christian faith, many of them were determined to civilize the heathens. To them, this looked like banning traditional Indian reproductive practices and dismissing Indigenous peoples' cultures. For centuries, these traditions helped define and mark birthing rituals for Indigenous peoples. These rituals even held connections between them and maturity, manhood, womanhood, and other elements of culture which were targeted and dismantled by European settlers. As a commonality between the oppression of reproductive freedom and rights for Black folks and Indigenous populations, it is evident that these early racist, misogynistic, and nationalistic practices formed the foundations for a culture of reproductive inequalities and injustices. Now Heather is going to take us into the turn of the century.
Thank you, Abby. At the turn of the century, the U.S. was making significant strides forward, both as a global leader, but also within its borders. Slavery was abolished in 1865, yet this didn't mean equality for Black folks living in the U.S. While the children of enslaved people could no longer be sold, reproductive freedom was far from equitable, and through the 20th century, Black bodies were used to further reproductive science. This can be seen from the unauthorized use of Henrietta Lacks' cervical cells, the HeLa cells, which have been implicated in early in vitro fertilization research, and most recently used in the study of COVID-19, but also to Norplant birth control, where in 1992, girls in a predominantly Black middle school in Baltimore were targeted via their school-based health clinic. This was just one of 100 schools that the makers of Norplant were monitoring, because up until this time, this contraceptive hadn't been tested on females as young. Additionally, at the turn of the century, the era of eugenics came about. Eugenics is a manipulation of reproduction to influence which characteristics get passed down to the next generation. Galton is often seen as the father of this theory with his 1865 paper, Hereditary Talent and Character. I think it's interesting how in the same year slavery was abolished, we have a paper that talks about the perceived character weaknesses of Black folks. It's easy to look back on this era and wonder how they could have been so ignorant, but this was the cutting edge science of the time. Unfortunately, it had devastating effects on marginalized populations that continue to feel the ripple effect of intergenerational trauma. Historically, folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities were seen as feeble-minded and were often subject to forced sterilizations and fear that their disabilities were heritable. The ripple effect of this practice is seen today as neurodivergent communities feared that there may be an uptick in abortions of suspected autistic fetuses following a study published last year that found an association between fetal anomalies and autism that could be detected in utero using ultrasonography. Eugenics brought about a surprising relationship between the white founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, and W.E.B. Du Bois, a prominent Black civil rights activist. In 1932, Sanger recruited Du Bois to help her promote contraceptives in areas predominantly poor and Black. Du Bois wrote an article in Sanger's magazine, Birth Control Review, urging Black folks who are low income to utilize birth control until they're in a position economically to raise children out of poverty. He went on to raise concern that the Black folks procreating are less intelligent and have children carelessly and disastrously. This culminated in a nod to eugenics with the statement, "They must learn that among human races and groups, as among vegetables, quality and not mere quantity really counts." The middle of the 20th century brought about an increase of policies designed to control the demographic makeup of the US. This ranged from immigration quotas on folks who didn't match the nationalistic ideals of being white and Christian to anti-miscegenation laws that prevented interracial marriages and, by extension, interracial children. By controlling who was allowed to immigrate and marry, US lawmakers were able to control who was reproducing, ultimately shaping what future generations would look like. We continue to see this today in the disproportionate visas granted to Muslim immigrants versus Christian immigrants. But controlling the demographics of the US through immigration isn't just about controlling the number of children born to immigrants. It's also about controlling who raises the children of immigrants, as evidenced during the Trump administration, with children at the southern border being separated from their parents while they were seeking asylum. The 20th century was also the time when women gained more autonomy over their reproductive rights with access to birth control, although only if you're married. Unmarried women had to wait another 7 years for access to birth control, and then another year for access to safe and legal abortions thanks to Roe v. Wade. It's noticeable that Roe v. Wade passed exactly 100 years after the Comstock Act, which arguably sparked the legal crusade against birth control and abortion with a series of acts that began by prohibiting lewd material being sent by post or through the mail, and extended to birth control and abortifacients. And those are meds and items used in abortions, but also in miscarriages. Who knew that access to abortion would face yet another legal crusade 50 years later with Dobbs v. Jackson? It's history repeating itself. Interestingly, during the time that Western feminists, predominantly white Western feminists, were campaigning for their reproductive freedom, they were simultaneously campaigning with the leaders of the US and other Western nations to introduce birth control in the countries deemed third world, where birth rates were seen as threatening to the security of the free world. This campaign coming hot off the heels of World War II, where the West fought against the Nazi regime's population control. This leaves one wondering if the US wasn't as concerned about population control as it was the method of control. Genocide being unacceptable, but forced sterilizations and birth control. Following Roe v. Wade, marginalized groups within the US were experiencing population control by way of federally funded long-acting contraceptives and sterilizations, often administered without full understanding or consent. Ash will now lead you into contemporary policies and politics.
Thanks, Heather. By the time we hit the 1990s, individuals in Black communities began to develop a deep mistrust about the American government and about the medical and pharmacological fields. This distrust was regarding the fear of being passively genocided through the administration of experimental drugs, as Heather discussed, or through the spreading of deadly and infectious diseases, such as syphilis during the Tuskegee experiment, HIV, AIDS, etc. It was found that individuals in Black communities were less likely to use contraceptives or engage in protected sex due to the fear of being passively genocided. Based on the injustices faced by Black people in America, these conspiracy beliefs are not unfounded. With the Native American population, healthcare access was gained through the Indian Health Service. Treaties between Native nations and the United States, as well as numerous pieces of legislation, such as the Snyder Act of 1921 and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act of 1976, produce and recognize a responsibility of the federal government to provide healthcare for Native people. However, only federally recognized tribal nations have access to this healthcare. The lack of adequate healthcare for facilities for Native people with uteruses profoundly restricts their reproductive rights and freedoms, as they are frequently unable to obtain the services they need, or they have to travel considerable distances to obtain these services at facilities contracted by the Indian Health Service. Because of this, there is a lack of healthcare for Native people during and after childbirth, for survivors of sexual assault, and virtually no access to contraception. Next slide, please. It is because of these issues that reproductive justice came into existence. it became apparent that reproductive rights did not encompass the true extent of the injustices that BIPOC individuals are facing in this realm. So what is the difference between reproductive justice and reproductive rights? Next slide, please. Ross and Salinger define reproductive justice as going beyond the pro-choice and pro-life debate and has three primary principles. 1, the right not to have a child. 2, the right to have a child. And 3, the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. In addition, reproductive justice demands sexual autonomy and gender freedom for every human being. Although reproductive justice emerges from and retains important ties to reproductive rights and reproductive health movements, reproductive justice simultaneously works from an expanded conceptualization of health, justice, economic security, and self-determination. Reproductive justice thus rejects narrow formulations of reproductive health as an individual experience and forcefully expands conceptualizations of health to include community needs and strengths. It is important to note that in the 21st century, it became apparent that there are people in the transgender community who did not identify as women, had uteruses, and the ability to reproduce just the same, and were therefore included in the conversation about reproductive justice. With this definition and the understanding of the uniquely different experiences of oppression of individuals from the BIPOC community in mind, Sister Song was founded. Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective was formed in 1997 by 16 organizations of women of color from the Native American, African American, Latina, and Asian American communities. They recognize that we have the right and responsibility to represent ourselves and our communities, and the equally compelling need to advance the perspectives and needs of women of color. Over the last 3 decades, more organizations and coalitions such as Sister Songs have made it their mission to bring reproductive justice to people with uteruses. Recently, Sister Song reclaimed a 4th principle of reproductive justice, the right to own one's body and control one's future. Next slide, please. In 2021, the state of Mississippi requested the Supreme Court to reverse all its previous abortion decisions made under W.E.B and return the question of abortion to the states. So let's talk about Roe v. Wade. Norma McCorvey, under the legal pseudonym Jane Brough, in 1969 became pregnant with her 3rd child. McCorvey wanted an abortion but lived in Texas, where abortion was illegal, except when necessary to save the parent's life. Her lawyers filed a lawsuit on her behalf in the U.S. federal court against her local district attorney, Henry Wade, alleging that Texas's abortion laws were unconstitutional. A special court in Texas heard the case and ruled in her favor. The parties appealed this ruling to the Supreme Court. In 1973, the Supreme Court issued a decision in McCorvey's favor, stating that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides a fundamental right to privacy, which protects a pregnant person's right to an abortion. The court also held that the right to abortion is not absolute and must be balanced against the government's interests in protecting women's health and prenatal life. The decision caused an ongoing debate in the United States about whether or to what extent abortion should be legal, who should decide the legality of abortion, and what the role of moral and religious views in the political sphere should be. Despite criticism of the decision, the Supreme Court reaffirmed Roe's central holding in its 1992 decision, Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Casey overruled Roe's trimester framework and abandoned its strict scrutiny standard in favor of an undue burden test. Under the undue burden standard, abortion restrictions were considered unconstitutional when they were enacted for the purpose or effect of placing a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion of a non-viable fetus. Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey were landmark decisions in the reproductive rights movements and provided pregnant people the autonomy to make personal reproductive decisions. These decisions, while crucial, were not the end of the road. They were meant to be the beginning. Next slide, please. In June 2022, the Supreme Court overruled Roe in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization on the grounds that the substantive right to abortion was not deeply rooted in this nation's history or tradition, nor considered a right when the Due Process Clause was ratified in 1968 and was unknown in U.S. law until Roe. This view was disputed by some legal historians and criticized by the dissenting opinion, which argued that many other rights, including contraception, interracial marriage, and same-sex marriage, did not exist when the Due Process Clause was ratified in 1968, and thus, by Dobbs's majority's logic, were not constitutionally protected. The overturning of Roe did not make abortions illegal nationwide. Abortions remain legal in most states, but the states with trigger laws to restrict abortion with Roe and Casey overturned immediately did so. In August 2022, Indiana became the first state to pass an abortion ban law after Dobbs. Next slide, please. This is the picture of the map with the status of abortions in each state. This was updated earlier this month, or last month, excuse me. Next slide, please. So what can be done about this? Reproductive justice advocates have questioned the dominant discourses about individual rights and the marketplace of choices that dominated the rhetoric of mainstream feminism, arguing that rights and choices are frequently denied to marginalized members of society. Any movement based primarily on the right to choice thus favors predominantly white middle-class women who are able to make reproductive decisions more easily than poor or low-income women and women of color whose options are limited by their social location. Next slide, please. To create a more inclusive movement than one focused predominantly on legal rights, primarily to abortion and contraception, the reproductive justice movement instead centers on reproductive oppression. This does not mean abandoning the notion of reproductive rights altogether, but rather locating rights inside a social framework. So what does that look like? It looks like a focus on the human right to make personal decisions about one's life and the obligation of government and society to ensure that the conditions are suitable for implementing one's decisions. Experiences at the micro level related to one's social identities, such as race, gender, sexual identity, class, etc., are seen as indicative of larger interlocking social inequalities at macro level, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, etc. Next slide, please. The application of reproductive justice as an analytical framework involves locating reproductive issues in relation to the multiple interweaving power relations of specific social contexts that structure people's reproductive lives, including social and systemic dynamics, social relations shaped by gender, ethnicity, race, class, and other social categorizations, and social cultural discourses and practices. Importantly, these power relations are also contextualized in relation to the historical oppressions that have contributed to the systemic devaluation and regulation of marginalized populations through colonization, slavery, population control, etc. Next slide, please. The decision on abortion has been put in the hands of the states. In the 1860s, the question of slavery was brought into the hands of the states as well, which divided the country into the North and the South, rather than making a joint decision to abolish it federally. And this is how we see history repeating itself. As you can see, there were steady movements towards reproductive justice over time, but we're walking backwards in real time right now. We're here to tell you that the time to cut the cord is right now. Thank you for listening.